This is a true story, but the names of the characters have been changed. Hi everyone, I'm Emily. Today, I'm sharing my story about Ethan, a guy who seemed perfect, but ended up teaching me one of the biggest lessons of my life. Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, thinking they were your whole world, only to realize they were just using you? If so, join me as I dive into how I confronted and overcame that betrayal. I'm sure you'll see a part of yourself somewhere in this story. And make sure to stick around until the end to see how I turned that pain into strength. I'm Emily, a sophomore majoring in sociology at New York University. Getting accepted into such a prestigious school was a huge milestone for me and my family back in Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slow, comfortable pace. It was the kind of place where neighbors stopped to chat on the sidewalk, and the quiet evenings are filled with the sound of crickets outside your bedroom window. Moving to New York City felt like stepping into a whole new world. At first, the endless noise, the lights, and the constant energy felt overwhelming, but I was quickly drawn to the city's unique charm. The hum of traffic, the endless things to see and do, the sense that there's always something happening, New York was unlike anything I'd ever known. The first few weeks in the dorm were both exciting and nerve-wracking. I spent most of my time getting used to my hectic schedule and trying not to get lost on my way to the library or lecture halls. My roommate, Jessica, was from the city and seemed to navigate everything so effortlessly. Jessica was lively and fearless, and soon enough, she was showing me the ropes how to get around on the subway, where to find cozy coffee shops in the West Village, and the places to get the best deals in Soho. We spent hours in those cafes, talking about our classes, future plans, and laughing about our lives here in New York. Jessica had a tight-knit group of friends, and before I knew it, I was part of the circle. One night in early September, Jessica invited me to a student party over in East Village. It was my first time going to one of these big New York gatherings, and I didn't know what to expect. We got to this rooftop apartment packed with people, loud EDM music blasting, and colored lights flashing everywhere. It was exhilarating and a bit overwhelming. I'd never seen anything like it, the room buzzing with laughter and dancing, friends and strangers all mixed together. I took a deep breath and told myself to let go for the night, to just take it all in. That was when I saw Ethan. He walked into the room like he owned it, with a self-assured smile that drew every gaze in the place, including mine. He was tall, had this laid-back charm, and there was something magnetic about the way he interacted with people. When his eyes met mine, I felt an undeniable pull. Ethan made his way over, smiled at me, and asked where I was from. And just like that, I was swept into his orbit, without a second thought. At first, being with Ethan felt like living in a dream. I'd catch him waiting outside my dorm with a coffee in hand, grinning like he'd been counting down the seconds to see me. One Saturday, out of the blue, he suggested we take the ferry to Staten Island. "You haven't seen New York until you've seen it from the water," he said, his eyes sparkling with excitement. We stood on the deck, wind whipping our hair as we watched the city skyline fade into the distance. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder as he pointed out landmarks, telling me stories about the city. It was one of those moments you'd imagine happening in a movie, and I could hardly believe it was real. Ethan loved surprising me. One Friday night, just as I was settling in to study, he texted me to come downstairs. When I got there, he was leaning against his car, a mischievous grin on his face. "Change of plans," he said, opening the car door for me. We drove through the city with the windows down, music blaring, and he took me to this tiny, hole-in-the-wall jazz club in Harlem that he said no one else knew about. We spent hours there, listening to live music and talking about everything under the sun. He ordered my favorite drink without even asking, and I remember looking at him across the table, wondering how he'd managed to become such an important part of my life in so little time. Ethan had a way of making even the most ordinary moments feel extraordinary. One afternoon, he convinced me to skip my study session for a spontaneous picnic in Central Park. He showed up with a basket packed with my favorite snacks and a blanket, and we spent hours lounging under the trees, laughing, and people watching. At one point, he pulled out a little sketchbook and started drawing me, his brow furrowed in concentration. I didn't know you could draw, I laughed, trying to peek. He just winked and said, there's a lot you don't know about me yet. The way he said it made me feel like there were endless layers to uncover, endless little mysteries that would make me fall for him even more. Then there was that one magical night in Times Square. It was late, and we were the only ones in the theater after catching a midnight showing of some indie film he'd been raving about. After the movie, instead of heading home, he pulled me by the hand into the heart of Times Square, where the lights made it feel like daytime even in the middle of the night. We danced right there on the sidewalk, surrounded by the neon lights and empty streets, as if the entire city was our stage. He spun me around, dipping me as he hummed some tune only he seemed to know. I remember laughing so hard I could hardly breathe, feeling weightless and completely lost in the moment. With Ethan, every day felt like a new story waiting to unfold, a chapter in this epic romance I'd stumbled into. He was spontaneous, unpredictable, and made me feel alive in a way I'd never experienced before. It was almost too perfect, like I was caught up in some whirlwind romance that could only end happily ever after. But deep down, I sometimes felt a strange twinge, an unexplainable sensation, like there was a piece of the puzzle missing. Ethan was perfect, almost too perfect, and a small part of me wondered if there was something beneath that charming, flawless exterior that he didn't want me to see. But every time I started to doubt, he'd flash that effortless smile, and I'd find myself falling all over again. In those early months, Ethan felt like the answer to every romantic hope I'd ever had. He seemed to know exactly what I needed, what made me happy, almost before I even knew myself. Friends around campus would comment on how lucky I was, some even a little envious of how attentive and thoughtful he was. My roommate Jessica would tease me, saying, "He's basically Prince Charming." And I'd laugh, because honestly, that's how it felt. Ethan was the kind of guy who would drop by just to make sure my day was going well, even if it was only for a few minutes between classes. He seemed so genuinely invested in everything about me. One evening after a long study session, he called me up, telling me to meet him at a little spot near campus. When I got there, he'd set up a mini-movie night on the rooftop of his apartment building. He had a projector set up, blankets spread out, and a pile of my favorite snacks. We lay there under the stars, watching old black and white films, while the lights of the city twinkled around us. It was one of those moments that seemed so effortlessly perfect that I wanted to pinch myself. When I told him how lucky I felt, he just smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face and say, "I just want you to be happy, Anne." But it wasn't long after that Ethan started mentioning some things about his family, hints at issues he was dealing with behind that perfect smile. It started off small. He mentioned in passing how his mother had been ill for a long time and how it took a toll on his family. I'd catch him looking distant sometimes, his gaze drifting off like he was lost in thought. When I'd ask, he'd give me that soft, almost regretful smile and say he didn't want to burden me with his troubles. It made me want to be there for him even more. I wanted him to know that he didn't have to be perfect around me, that I was there for him just as he'd been there for me. Then, one evening, as we were walking through Washington Square Park, he stopped and looked at me, a pained expression in his eyes. He admitted that things had been rough lately, that the medical bills for his mom were piling up, and that he was struggling to balance everything. He told me he didn't want me to worry, but he just needed a little help this one time, just to get by. My heart broke seeing him so vulnerable, and without a second thought, I offered to lend him some money from my savings. He looked relieved, thanking me with that familiar, soft smile, and told me he'd pay me back as soon as he could. At first, it was just a small amount here and there, enough to cover his emergency expenses, he'd say, assuring me that it was just temporary. But soon, he started needing more. Each time, he'd have a reason that tugged at my heart, his mom's condition worsening, unexpected fees for his classes, or car repairs he couldn't put off. I wanted to be a support system, to be someone he could lean on. So, without hesitation, I dipped deeper into my savings, wanting to ease his burdens however I could. When my savings ran low, I even asked Jessica to lend me a bit so I could help him. She hesitated at first, giving me a concerned look and asking if everything was okay, but I brushed it off, laughing and saying, "You know how these things go, life is unpredictable." She didn't press, but a hint of worry lingered in her eyes. I ignored it, focusing instead on how grateful Ethan seemed each time I helped him out, his reassurances that he'd pay me back as soon as he could. In those moments, there was a small, nagging feeling that I tried to ignore, a quiet voice in the back of my mind asking if something was off. But then Ethan would hold my hand, kiss my forehead, and tell me how lucky he was to have someone as understanding as me. He'd promised that everything would be back to normal soon, that he was working on it, and I'd feel that familiar warmth and trust flood back. Whatever doubts I had would fade, replaced by the hope that this was just a rough patch we'd get through together. I told myself that love meant being there for someone, no matter what. In those first months with Ethan, everything felt enchanted, almost surreal. Every glance, every smile, and every small gesture seemed perfectly calibrated to make me feel seen and cherished in a way I'd never experienced. He had this knack for saying the right thing, for making even the smallest moments feel like something out of a fairy tale. "You're lucky, Emily," people would say, and I'd just smile, nodding in agreement. Because I did feel lucky. He felt like magic, like he knew exactly what I needed, even before I did. Jessica, my roommate, would joke about it, calling him Prince Charming whenever he appeared with a coffee or insisted on walking me back after a late study session. "I swear, he's gonna pull up on a horse one day," she'd laugh. And secretly, I almost wished he would. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd somehow found someone truly different, someone who would be there for me in every way that mattered. But no matter how close we got, there were parts of him that felt just out of reach. It started small, barely noticeable at first. He'd let slip a remark about his mom's health, something vague but enough to sound serious. Or he'd sigh, dropping hints about pressure back home, expectations he felt but never fully explained. "It's just complicated," he'd say, with a weary smile, and I didn't press. Everyone has their own struggles, right? And I wanted to be the kind of girlfriend who trusted, who didn't pry. Then, one evening in Washington Square Park, he finally opened up more than usual. We were walking, our hands entwined, when he suddenly stopped, looking at me with an expression that made my heart skip. "Emily," he started, his voice barely a whisper, "I haven't told you everything." He told me about his family's financial strain, the relentless medical bills piling up for his mother, and the pressure he felt trying to keep up with everything. His face looked pained, his eyes darker than I'd ever seen them, and in that moment, I felt a fierce desire to protect him. Without hesitation, I offered to help. "You don't have to carry this all by yourself, Ethan," I said softly, reaching for his hand. The relief in his eyes was immediate. He squeezed my hand, promising he'd pay me back, that this was a one-time thing, that I was his rock. And I believed him. All the uncertainty I'd felt melted away. Here he was, finally letting me in, showing me the vulnerable side of himself. It felt like a turning point, a deepening of our connection, something that would bring us closer. But soon, helping him became more of a pattern than a rare moment of support. A few weeks later, he called, frantic, saying his car had broken down and he couldn't afford the repairs. "I'm just stuck, Em," he murmured, his voice laced with desperation. "If I don't get this fixed, I'll lose my job." I didn't even think twice, dipping into my savings again. The gratitude in his eyes, the way he held my hand and reassured me it was just a rough patch, made me want to believe him. "I'll make it up to you, I swear. Once things settle down, you'll see," he'd say, and I convinced myself that love meant giving without expecting anything in return. But his emergencies didn't stop. There was always something, a forgotten tuition fee, a friend who'd helped him out but now needed to be repaid, another issue with his car. Each time, he'd appear at my door, or text me with that familiar urgency, assuring me that this was the last time. Every time he promised that things would be different soon. But as my own savings dwindled, I couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at me. The way he asked, the way he reassured me, it all started to feel rehearsed, like a well-worn story he knew by heart. Eventually, I had to ask Jessica for a loan, feeling a pang of guilt but brushing it off as temporary. Jessica gave me a long, searching look, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure everything's okay with him, Em?" she asked, hesitant but clearly worried. I forced a smile, laughing it off. "He's just going through a tough time," I said, trying to convince her, and myself, that there was nothing to worry about. Then came the night everything unraveled. Jessica and I were studying late at a cafe near campus when I noticed a group of girls from our school, whispering and glancing my way. One of them, a tall brunette named Tara, finally approached our table, a sly smirk on her face. "You're Ethan's girlfriend, right?" she asked, her tone cutting. "Yes, why?" I replied, my voice laced with confusion. Her smirk widened. "Just a heads up, honey, you're not the only one he's got emergencies with." She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Check your bank account. He's been milking a few of us with his sob stories for months now." The color drained from my face, but I forced a laugh, brushing it off. "You're wrong," I said, but my voice shook. Tara just shrugged, throwing me one last pitying glance. "Believe what you want, sweetheart," she said, turning to leave. Jessica put her hand on my arm, her face etched with concern. "Emily, are you okay? Maybe you should check." I went home that night, heart pounding, barely able to focus on anything but the thought gnawing at me. The next morning, I did what I'd been afraid to do for months. I checked my bank account. The number staring back at me felt like a punch to the gut. My savings were nearly gone. I couldn't believe it. All those emergencies, those heartfelt promises, it was all so much more than I'd ever realized. I sat there in silence, my stomach churning, the betrayal settling over me like a dark cloud. Determined to confront him, I texted Ethan, asking him to meet me at a quiet cafe. Jessica insisted on coming along, and for once, I felt grateful for her steady presence. When Ethan arrived and saw Jessica beside me, I saw a flicker of surprise, maybe even irritation, but he quickly masked it with his familiar smile, sliding into the seat across from us. Taking a deep breath, I laid everything out, the loans, the missed repayments, the lies. His expression shifted, moving from surprise to frustration as he struggled to find excuses. When he tried to brush it off, saying I was overreacting, I pressed harder, refusing to let him slip away this time. The charm was gone from his face, replaced by an icy look I'd never seen before. "So what if I needed help?" he finally snapped, his tone cold. "You were more than happy to play the role of the perfect girlfriend, Emily." His words cut deep, each one landing like a blow, shattering every illusion I'd ever held about him. In that moment, the fairy tale ended, and I was left staring at a stranger, someone who'd only ever seen me as a means to an end. After that painful confrontation in the cafe, I thought I was done with Ethan. I wanted nothing more to do with him. But as I tried to rebuild my life, strange things started happening that made it impossible to just leave him behind. He'd show up outside my dorm unexpectedly, acting like nothing had happened. The first time, I tried to ignore him, but he called out to me, saying he just wanted to talk things through. When I told him to leave, he raised his hands in a mock surrender, laughing it off as though our last conversation had been some kind of joke. His casual attitude infuriated me, but it also left me unsettled. For days, I kept wondering if I had missed something, if, somehow, I was the one who had misunderstood everything. Then, one night, as Jessica and I were studying in our room, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was short and cryptic. "You're not the only one he's done this to. Want to know more?" My heart skipped a beat. I showed it to Jessica, who immediately urged me to respond. "What if it's another girl he scammed?" she whispered, her eyes wide with intrigue and anger. I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but my curiosity won out. I texted back, "Who is this?" Minutes later, another message came through, telling me to meet at a coffee shop off campus the next evening. The sender didn't leave a name, only a time and location. Jessica insisted on coming along for support, so the next night, we found ourselves sitting in a dimly lit corner of the cafe, anxiously watching the door. After a few tense minutes, a girl around my age walked in. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back and a wary look in her eyes. She scanned the room, spotted us, and came over. She introduced herself as Lila, and within minutes, she confirmed my worst fears. She, too, had fallen for Ethan's charm at a party almost exactly like the one where I'd met him. He'd swept her off her feet, made her feel like the center of his world, and then, piece by piece, he'd started asking for help. A few dollars here, a few dollars there, until it had spiraled into hundreds, and then thousands. She'd been too ashamed to tell anyone until she'd heard rumors that he had other girlfriends around campus. Our stories lined up eerily well, the same emergencies, the same promises to pay her back, the same reassurances. Just as I was processing this, Lila pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were photocopies of text messages, PayPal transactions, and even a few photos she'd snapped of Ethan with other girls around campus. My stomach churned as I recognized some of the same messages he'd sent me, word for word. Jessica gasped as she skimmed through the evidence, her expression a mix of shock and anger. "He's been doing this to girls for years," Lila said, her voice low but steady. I thought I was the only one, but then I started hearing about others. Some didn't want to come forward because they felt too embarrassed, but I knew I couldn't just let him keep doing this. That night, as Jessica, Lila, and I sat together, an idea began to take shape, a plan to collect as much evidence as we could and expose Ethan for who he really was. Over the next few weeks, we reached out to other girls, some through social media, others in person. We started hearing back almost immediately. Some were shy and reluctant, embarrassed about what had happened, but others were angry, eager to help. We gathered stories, screenshots, bank statements, and even voice messages. Then one evening, Jessica suggested something bold. What if we could catch him in the act? She looked over at me, eyes gleaming with determination. At first, I thought she was crazy, but as she laid out her plan, it started to sound more and more plausible. With Lila's help, we managed to set up a fake profile, posing as a new girl on campus. We used a picture from an obscure stock photo and gave her a name we'd overheard Ethan mention as his type. Within days, he reached out, texting her with the same predictable charm we'd all fallen for. His routine was laughably similar. He asked to meet up, complimented her incessantly, and within a week, began hinting at needing just a bit of cash to get through an emergency. The next step was to document everything. We recorded their conversations, took screenshots of every message, and even got a voice recording of him mentioning his supposed debt and the other crazy girls on campus who had misunderstood him. Our pile of evidence was getting massive. In the days following our confrontation, I thought that would be the end of Ethan's presence in my life. With the video circulating around campus, his reputation was in ruins. People began avoiding him in the hallways, and his once bright social circle had all but disappeared. I assumed he'd slip away quietly, too humiliated to stay on campus. But Ethan wasn't someone who let go that easily. One rainy evening, about a week after everything had gone down, I was walking back to my dorm after a late study session at the library. The campus was quiet, the pathways dimly lit and slick with rain. Just as I was about to turn the last corner toward my building, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, looking exhausted and disheveled. He called my name, asking if we could talk. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to avoid anything he had to say, but something stopped me. His face held an expression I'd never seen before, a kind of rawness and desperation that almost made me forget, for a split second, everything he'd put me through. He said he was sorry, that he never meant for things to spiral so out of control. He claimed that I had meant something different to him, that I was the only person who'd truly cared. Despite myself, I listened, but my anger and disbelief remained. He tried to explain away his actions, speaking about how trapped he'd felt, how he'd been doing what he thought was necessary to keep going. He talked about the struggles with his family and how he'd convinced himself he had no other options. But as he spoke, all I could think of were the lies, the betrayals, and the hurt he'd caused. His attempt at explaining his actions felt hollow, and a part of me wondered if he truly understood the weight of his choices, or if he was just hoping I'd forgive him and move on. After that encounter, Ethan's presence faded from my life, but the weight of his words lingered. He'd said he needed me, that I'd helped him in a way he couldn't explain, and yet it felt like an empty confession, a final attempt to manipulate my sympathy. I tried to brush it off, but for days afterward, his words echoed in my mind, causing me to reflect on everything that had happened. I realized that part of me had wanted him to offer a genuine explanation, an apology that might make sense of everything. But that was something Ethan could never give. Determined not to let his words haunt me, I threw myself into my studies and campus activities, working to fill the gaps left by betrayal. I volunteered at a women's support group on campus, where I met other students who had been through their own struggles. Listening to their stories, I began to understand that my experience with Ethan was only a part of my journey. These women inspired me, we shared our stories, and offered each other encouragement and perspective. Slowly, my life started to feel full again, not because I'd forgotten the pain, but because I'd found new reasons to hope and trust. Meanwhile, as graduation loomed, Ethan's shadow on campus all but vanished. He became a ghost in every sense, a reminder of someone who had tried to deceive, but failed to break us. Rumors drifted through the campus grapevine that he'd been struggling to find a new social group, that he was spending most of his time alone, keeping to the background as if he, too, were waiting for graduation to end so he could finally disappear. Occasionally, I'd spot him in the library or at the edge of a campus event, always looking like he was on the outside looking in, his former charisma gone. He seemed like someone who had lost more than friends. He had lost himself. For me, things began to fall into place. I grew closer to the girls who had once been strangers, bound together by a shared experience. Jessica, Lila, and I became an inseparable trio, spending late nights laughing over coffee, studying for exams, and supporting one another through ups and downs. Together, we healed and grew. We made a pact to let go of the hurt Ethan had caused, to no longer let him take up space in our minds. It was a promise to ourselves to move forward, to learn from what happened, and to embrace a future unclouded by his influence. As graduation day approached, I felt a sense of closure settling over me. Standing on that stage, cap and gown in place, I thought about the person I'd been when I first arrived on campus, naive, trusting, and open to new connections. Now, I was walking away stronger and wiser, carrying a hard-earned understanding of myself and the strength it took to recover from betrayal. My family cheered from the audience, and I spotted Jessica and Lila in their caps, beaming at me with pride. I felt a surge of gratitude for them and for the journey that had brought us together. After the ceremony, Jessica, Lila, and I found a quiet spot on campus, where we exchanged gifts and promised to stay close even after we each moved on to the next chapter of our lives. Lila handed me a small bracelet with a tiny engraved charm. "For strength," she said. Jessica held up a photo of the three of us from one of our late-night study sessions, and we all laughed, hugging each other and wiping away a few happy tears. As we said our goodbyes and stepped into the future, I realized I no longer carried any bitterness. What remained was a quiet confidence, a belief in myself and the friendships that had carried me through. Ethan was a chapter I'd closed, a memory that had no place in the life I was building. Moving forward, I knew I'd carry the lessons I'd learned, but I was no longer bound by them. I walked away from campus that day with a smile, ready to face whatever lay ahead, free from Ethan's shadow, surrounded by friends who had become family. After graduation, I moved to a new city for grad school, leaving behind New York and, along with it, the remnants of that painful chapter. My new life took shape slowly but surely. I joined study groups, made new friends, and took up hobbies I hadn't had time for before. Jessica and I kept in touch, as did the group of women who had once been victims of Ethan's lies. We'd all moved on in different directions, but the bond we'd formed remained strong, each of us a reminder to the others that we'd survived and come out stronger. Yet, Ethan's betrayal had left its mark. I found myself more cautious in new relationships, questioning people's motives in a way I never had before. When I started dating again, I was more reserved, unwilling to give away too much of myself until I was sure I could trust the person. The experience had reshaped how I saw others and, more importantly, how I saw myself. I had become more aware of my own strength, of my ability to see through deception, and of the value of trusting my instincts. I learned that kindness and empathy didn't mean I had to ignore red flags or compromise my boundaries. Life in my new city felt liberating. I dove into my studies, immersing myself in research and lectures, finding inspiration and purpose. My friendships grew deeper, too, as I formed connections based on shared passions and mutual respect. I joined a hiking group, discovering the therapeutic power of nature. The climbs were challenging, but the view from each summit reminded me of the strength I had built within myself. I even began volunteering at a women's support center on weekends, where I shared my story to help others recognize their own resilience. One evening, while flipping through an old journal, I found an entry I'd written shortly after our final confrontation with Ethan. The words felt foreign, like a distant echo of someone I used to be. In that moment, I realized just how much I'd changed and how far I'd come. The pain and betrayal had transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I knew I'd never let anyone manipulate me like that again. Ethan had become a footnote in my story, a painful lesson, yes, but ultimately a small part of a much larger journey. I'd learned to forgive myself for being vulnerable, for trusting someone who didn't deserve it. And as I moved forward, I felt a sense of peace, a clarity that came from knowing I'd left that chapter firmly in the past. But every so often, life threw me gentle reminders of how far I'd come. Once, I saw a familiar face in a cafe, Jessica, in town for a conference. We spent hours reminiscing, laughing about the absurdity of the situations we'd survived, but also marveling at the growth we'd each experienced. She had started her own nonprofit, inspired by our ordeal, advocating for mental health and relationship education for young adults. Seeing her passion and determination, I felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that we'd both turned a painful chapter into something positive. Later that year, I decided to organize a small reunion with the women who had once been Ethan's victims. We met up in a cozy restaurant, sharing stories about our new lives and accomplishments. One was preparing to launch her own business, another had gotten into her dream law school. Each of us had found ways to move forward, to channel the pain we'd once carried into something meaningful. As I looked around the table at the women who had become not only my friends but my chosen family, I realized that our experiences had connected us in a way that few could understand. Together, we had faced one of our lowest points, and together, we had risen from it. In their laughter and strength, I saw my own resilience reflected back at me. Ethan's betrayal was now just a thread in the rich tapestry of our lives, a reminder of what we had overcome and what we had become. Then, one crisp autumn day, while walking through a local park, I saw him, Ethan. He looked different, more subdued, a hint of weariness in his posture. He hadn't noticed me at first, but as I turned to leave, he looked up, his eyes locking with mine. For a moment, I considered walking away, letting the past stay in the past. But something held me in place. He approached, his expression uncertain, almost pleading. "Hey. I didn't think I'd see you here," he said, stuffing his hands awkwardly into his pockets. "Neither did I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. He hesitated, then sighed. "I've wanted to reach out for a while now. There's a lot I need to say, things I didn't understand back then." He looked down, shuffling his feet as if searching for the right words. I crossed my arms, cautious but willing to listen. "I'm here now. Say what you need to." He met my gaze, and I saw a flicker of the Ethan I'd once known, or thought I'd known. I never really understood what I was doing to people, to you. I just kept telling myself it was survival. I thought that needing people meant using them, and I didn't realize how badly I was hurting everyone around me. I held his gaze, my face expressionless. His words felt genuine, but I couldn't ignore the hurt he'd caused, or how hard it had been to rebuild my trust in people. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied, my tone measured. "But that doesn't erase what happened, Ethan. What you did hurt a lot of people. You left scars on people's lives that don't just go away with an apology." He nodded, his face pained. I know. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. I've been seeing a counselor, working through a lot of things. You were right to walk away, and honestly, it made me realize how much I needed to face myself. I looked at him, feeling a strange mixture of empathy and detachment. I'd wanted this conversation once, to hear him admit his mistakes, to acknowledge the pain he'd caused. But now that he was finally doing it, it felt distant. Like it didn't matter as much as it once did. Good, I said, finally. I'm glad you're working on yourself. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Ethan. I really do. He seemed taken aback by my calmness, perhaps expecting anger or bitterness. But those emotions had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of closure. Thank you, he said softly. For listening, and for being kind. I managed a small smile, one that felt freeing. Take care, Ethan. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him in the past where he belonged. As I stepped forward, the weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying lifted, leaving me with a sense of peace. I was done with Ethan, truly and completely, and as I continued through the park, I felt ready, really ready, to embrace the life waiting for me, free and whole. From that point on, I embraced life with a new sense of purpose. I focused on building a future that reflected my values, choosing relationships with care and investing in those who valued honesty and integrity. I knew there would be challenges ahead, moments of doubt, but I also knew that I was ready. I'd learned to trust myself, to guard my heart without closing it off entirely, and to approach each new chapter with openness and strength. I was free, and finally, I was ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, stronger and more resilient than ever. And perhaps, most importantly, I had learned that while some chapters may be painful, they do not define the whole story. I was the author of my life, and my future was mine to shape, with lessons learned, a heart still open to possibility, and a spirit unbreakable. As I walked away from Ethan that night, a quiet sense of finality settled over me, yet part of me couldn't help but wonder. Had he truly changed, or was he just weaving another layer of his story, convincing himself as much as he'd once convinced me? His words lingered, tugging at my thoughts as I made my way home, stirring questions I knew might never have answers. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on how much he'd shaped my journey, not as a love story, but as a pivotal lesson. The experience had left marks I hadn't fully realized, new layers of caution, resilience, and perhaps a sharper view of the world. It made me wonder, though, if people like Ethan could change, would they even want to? Or was he forever bound to the person he'd been, chasing validation through half-truths and charm? Sometimes I wondered if he ever looked back and questioned himself, if he felt regret or understood the impact he'd left on my life and the lives of so many others. Perhaps he was capable of becoming someone different, someone better. Or maybe some people, no matter how much time passes, are simply destined to repeat their own mistakes. As for me, I knew I'd moved beyond that chapter, stepping into a future that no longer had room for ghosts from my past. But every so often, I'd find myself looking back, just for a moment, and wondering, could someone like him ever truly change? Or was he, in the end, just another lesson, a story without redemption, meant to remind me of the strength I'd found on my own? The answer, perhaps, would never come, leaving me, and anyone else who crossed his path, to draw our own conclusions about who he really was, and who he might one day become.